Queremos imenso agradecer esta oportunidade de discutir o futebol e o contexto global. O Clube de Lisboa é uma associação que, no fundo, tem este intuito, ou seja, o de trabalhar as questões internacionais que nós consideramos que não são suficientemente discutidas na sociedade portuguesa, e foi com esse objetivo justamente que convidámos o Simon Kuper e o Vasco Mendonça, que aqui será o nosso moderador e que nos irá apresentar de seguida, mas gostaríamos apenas de agradecer a todos por aqui estarem e dizer que, obviamente, o Clube de Lisboa vai continuar a fazer as suas Lisbon Talks este ano, e decidimos começar 2020, ano de campeonato europeu. Decidimos começar este ano com justamente uma conversa sobre o futebol nas suas diversas facetas, nos seus aspectos, talvez menos trabalhados, mas que são, para além do prazer de ver jogar futebol, são aspectos absolutamente fascinantes, e temos a sorte de ter connosco um convidado de luxo. E, portanto, sem mais demoras, passo a palavra ao Vasco Mendonça, que aqui será o árbitro deste jogo.
Bom dia a todos. Parece-me que agora será o momento adequado para passar para o inglês. So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this edition of Lisbon Talks. First of all, a personal note. It is an honor for me to be invited to be a discussant at this event. I've followed both Simon and Raquel for a long time now. Simon was probably the first. I wouldn't call him a sports journalist. I don't think he considers himself strictly a sports journalist. But I've first discovered Simon as someone who I thought was strictly a sports journalist, and soon realized he was someone that just was diving much deeper into this very interesting intersection between sports, culture, politics, and it's been almost 20 years since I first started reading Simon. A few of his books are here for anyone to browse. Feel free to browse through the books if you want to. Also, Raquel's book, latest book, is here as well. Simon, as I was saying, is a journalist for the Financial Times. He has written extensively about the sport. Ajax, for example, has been the subject of one of his books. Ajax, the Dutch, the War. Football Against the Enemy, which, how old is this book originally, the first edition? Yeah, so 26 years. I was 12 at the time when the book first came out. So I read it a while later, as you can imagine. But still, like, it was just a moment of discovery reading this book. Truly a moment of discovery. More recently, he wrote Soccernomics, and he actually told us yesterday at dinner that he's writing a book about Barcelona, which I am truly excited about. So let's wait for that a couple more months. Raquel is a professor and a researcher who has also spent an extensive amount of time thinking and writing about the sport. She also happens to be a Benfica fan, so there's some affinity there, but I don't want to make that a central topic of discussion, as you might imagine. So, I mean, it's an honor to be here. I'm much like yourselves. I'm here mostly to listen. I will try to provoke or engage with both Simon and Raquel to enrich the conversation, but I think now would be the best time to hand it over to Simon and Raquel, or Raquel. I'm not sure who would. Okay, so Simon would go first. Both of them had prepared some small presentations, which I feel would be a very interesting trigger for the remainder of the conversation. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, sorry. Football and politics, huge topic. We could take it in many directions. I want to talk briefly about how politicians use football or try to use football to become leaders of their country, and how this is developing as a fashion, let's say. Well, as you said, I began thinking about these topics a very long time ago in the 80s, when football and politics wasn't really discussed much. I think most political scientists, social scientists thought that football was too banal a topic. It wasn't worthy of serious consideration. But I had this idea that there was something there. I mean, I'm not the only person, but this was my particular path. I grew up in the Netherlands, and I've always been a fan of the Dutch team. And I was very much struck in 1988 when Holland beat West Germany in the European Championships in the semi-final. It was really the biggest moment in the history of Dutch football, much bigger than the 3 World Cup finals. And millions of people went out onto the streets to celebrate this victory over Germany. And people threw bikes in the air, and they shouted, "We have our bikes back," which was a reference to the German soldiers in World War II impounding Dutch bicycles. And everyone understood that this had a lot to do, this match was about World War II in some complicated way. And I thought, wow, that's really what football can do. I read the odd fact or story or falsehood that intrigued me. For example, I read that when Brazil won the World Cup in 1970, it helped keep the Brazilian military regime in power. Now, I later realized this was nonsense. It had no such effect. But anyway, this is one of the things that got me thinking. Or there was the story of Pele visiting Nigeria in 1969 during the Biafran War, and both sides in the war taking a ceasefire to allow Pele to play a match there. That same year, you probably know the story of the football war between El Salvador and Honduras, which had to do with other things beyond football. I mean, there were issues between the two countries around migration, around territory, but the fact is that the football war did begin with a bad-tempered football match between El Salvador and Honduras, and I think several thousand people were killed. So there were a lot of reasons to think that football and politics had interesting connections, and my first book, as you kindly mentioned, Football Against the Enemy, tries to pursue this in this kind of world journey through 22 countries. So let's focus on this one specific issue of how politicians use football or try to. And I want to start with the country that's really ground zero of football and politics, which is Argentina, where I went on for my Football Against the Enemy journey. There's a lot of evidence over time that the regime fixed that World Cup. And this was a regime that had enormous faith in the power of football. It invested an estimated 10% of the national budget for 1978 in the World Cup. And in the end, they succeed in their own minds. Argentina wins, people are on the streets chanting Argentina. And in the kind of fascist worldview, this is the aim. You have the united nation, patriotic, there are no dissidents. And they thought, well, football is the opium of the people. You give your subjects the World Cup, they will love you. It's as simple as that. But I think they were completely wrong. I've been to Argentina a couple of times trying to understand the '78 World Cup, and none of the historians or social scientists or writers I interviewed about 1978 believe that it did the regime any good beyond, of course, the few days of euphoria. I mean, how long does a World Cup last? How long does Portugal winning Euro 2016 last as a kind of social and political fact of euphoria that overrides everything else? I suggest these are very brief periods. And to put it simply, people can think. If you are poor and you're hungry and frightened and you're champion of the world, you're happy to be champion of the world, but you're still unhappy with your situation. And maybe all people want is bread and games, but as the Argentine filmmaker Osvaldo Baja said in 1978, and excuse my Spanish, he said something like, poco pan, muchos juegos. So you need a bit of both. And fans are intelligent enough, or citizens, to make the distinction between the dictator and the football team. So when Videla appeared in the stadiums in '78, he was booed, he was whistled, and the players were cheered. A few years after the World Cup in 1983, the junta gives way to an elected civilian government. So if the generals thought that they could save their jobs by putting the nation's money into football, it's a very naive worldview. And these generals were the kind of bullies of the classroom who had taken over the lesson and they lacked any kind of sense of how a society works. And in fact, people on the streets, as you saw in that clip, is a dangerous thing for regimes. It's great when they're chanting Argentina, but very quickly the mood can change. And you see this in Iran, where some of the strongest protests against the regime in recent years have been after football matches that Iran has won. You get a lot of people on the streets, you get men and women dancing, you get some people drinking, you get clashes with the Revolutionary Guards. So these are very tense moments for the Iranian government. Similarly, in Argentina 78, I interviewed this former Argentine professional footballer, Claudio Tamborini, and he had been jailed and tortured by the regime and escaped from jail in March 1978, a few months before the final, before the World Cup. And he was in hiding, but when the streets filled up after the final, he came out and joined the crowds. And he told me, I went out and cheered and I felt happy about the victory. And he said, after the crowds reclaimed the streets post-final, the regime never got the streets back. Because before, Argentinians had been afraid to go outside. The streets were guarded by soldiers with machine guns. You had no business being outside, certainly not in groups. So the kind of euphoria and the crowd effects of football are very dangerous for dictatorial regimes. Football is a dangerous instrument for regimes. You never know which way it's going to take you. Still, it's pretty standard to do what Videla did and for politicians to pose as football fans. I want to show you, and some of them genuinely are. Pope he comes from the Argentinian Italian origin lower middle class. Italian families in poorer parts of Buenos Aires who became the major part of the Peronista support. And I would submit that the Pope is a politician as well as everything else. He's a man of God, but he's a politician as well in the Peronista tradition. And this tradition is that you have to see him as a ruler like a regular guy. So you have these symbols like Perón, and in the Pope's case, they are his old Fiat second-hand car, the simple guest room in which he lives in this Vatican building, and San Lorenzo, his favorite football club, which isn't even one of the giants of Buenos Aires football. It's his local club. And these are symbols to say, although I'm a virgin in my 80s who is leader of a great global religion, I am a regular guy like you. And I think for him, football has helped. It has helped him position himself much more successfully than the previous Pope as someone like us. Pope John Paul, who was also a big football fan, he used that in similar ways. And I think it's totally sincere. I think he really is a football fan, but you can still use it. In fact, it's more powerful because it's real. Here's somebody else. This is a documentary about Emmanuel Macron's campaign. And the woman you see is Brigitte, his wife. He's cursing because Marseille, supposedly his football team, have lost to Monaco. This, of course, is filmed for the documentary. With Macron, who's a born actor, and his wife, who was his drama teacher, you wonder to what degree is this a staged event. But anyway, Macron realizes the power of football. And he got lucky because a year into his presidency, this happens. He wins the World Cup. And you'd think, well, this is fantastic. This is a great success for him. It will help him along. In fact, it may have a negative impact on him because the French public gets annoyed with him crawling all over the team and joining in the celebrations. And very soon, of course, the country moves on to other things. 4 months after this moment, the Gilets jaunes movement starts. And by December 2018, his approval ratings are at their lowest ever. So the victory and the Football Association doesn't seem to help him at all. And you see that generally this posing as a fan or being a real fan doesn't tend to help European politicians very much. In Britain, David Cameron always used to get into trouble because he would forget that his favorite football team was supposed to be Aston Villa. He realized you had to pose as a fan, but he was not able to do this in any kind of convincing way, and it adds to the impression of insincerity. So the football fan leader model is not very important or powerful. What is much more powerful is the football figure who moves out of football and uses his football status in politics. And the pioneer of this move is Silvio Berlusconi. Now, it's often said that Italy provides a model for dysfunctional political movements that only catch on. It pioneers dysfunctional political movements that then go on to capture the world. Mussolini did it with fascism. The Cinque Stelle movement have done it with digital politics, and Berlusconi does it with football politics. So he takes over AC Milan in 1985, a club recovering from a big bribery scandal. He makes it modern and organized and wins European Cups. And then in 1993, he founds a party named after a football chant, Forza Italia. And he goes on television and he gives a speech explaining why he's going into politics. And he starts with a football metaphor. He says, I have chosen to take the field. And he makes this pitch that he will transform Italy just as he has transformed his football club. So I think the phrase in Italian is fare l'Italia come il Milan. I hope I have this right. Make Italy like Milan. And this is a model that has eluded political philosophers for centuries, the football club as a model for the state. But it's very popular. And he uses this football language all the way through. His candidates are called Azzurri, like the players of the Italian football team. His local parties are called clubs. And this is all very thought through. John Foote, in his book Calcio, A History of Italian Football, writes, after long research, Berlusconi's advisors came to the conclusion that the only language that unites Italians was that to do with football. Half the electorate are self-confessed football fans, after all. So Berlusconi can make this very plausible case that I have succeeded in football and I will transfer that into politics in a way that glory chasers like Videla or Macron can't. I mean, I don't believe in Berlusconi's case. I don't believe there is a parallel at all, but it's plausible to a lot of the public. And it's also, it solves the problem that many billionaire businessmen have when they want to go into politics, that often their business success has been invisible to the public. I mean, who can name the heads of Portugal's biggest companies? I'm sure in the Chamber of Commerce you can, but most Portuguese people most likely cannot. But they can name the president of Benfica, the president of Porto. So if you want to have a kind of public business career, the best place to do that is in sport. In 1994, the year after Forza Italia is launched, the general manager of the Texas Rangers Baseball Club runs for governor of Texas. He's a recovering alcoholic in his 40s. He has not done very much. He has nothing on his CV, really. So he talks about baseball. And it makes him look like a regular guy, even though he comes from a very wealthy patrician family. And the connection with America's most American sport makes him seem ultimately American. And so George W. Bush is elected governor of Texas. And very soon, he begins to parlay that into a bigger political prize. And the rest, unfortunately, is history. So this model of sports politics, pioneered in modern times by Berlusconi, I think in our century has become much more powerful. And why is that? Because with the populist sentiment that's sweeping the world, there's distrust of political parties and career politicians. So in the past, the politician would rise through the ranks of his party, typically men, his party, and then become leader of the country. Whereas in modern democracies, if you're a party animal, that discredits you in the eyes of the public. Look at what happened to Hillary Clinton. So instead, you can rise through celebrity television or through sport and then go into politics. And this brings me back to Argentina. In 2001, I was invited to this event at Oxford University. The president of the Boca Juniors Football Club was coming to talk to us, talk about how he planned to parlay his football role into a political career. So they invited some academics and some Argentina curious strays like me. And we met this guy, Mauricio Macri, who immediately when you saw him, he was a sort of obvious man of destiny. He was handsome, rich, intelligent, funny. He was very wealthy through his father, and you could see this guy had political potential. So we had this very English lunch of soggy lamb chops, and then he gave this PowerPoint presentation, much more professional than mine, where he talks about how he's going to go from football to politics. And he told us the first thing that helps is I don't have to invest any capital to be known. I have 98% recognition. And he said, look, Boca is the people's club in Argentina, so it's a great platform. obviously, although he didn't say this, for a rich daddy's boy like himself to convert himself into looking like a regular guy. And he viewed the Argentine football circus with a kind of cold outsider's eye. I'm sure he really was a football fan, but he could see how to instrumentalize it. And he said, Boca in my presidency has experienced its most spectacular cycle in 100 years. They won a lot of trophies. And every Monday after they won, his marketing people would go to work and they'd make posters and videos mocking the fans of the rival River Plate, for example, showing River fans who they called chickens. So they'd show chickens going to the airport after River had lost. And why did he do that? He said to create craziness, because craziness sells match tickets, and it also gets the creator of it a lot of attention, as we've seen in the US in recent times. So I left Oxford that day thinking, wow, you know, this guy Macri is going places. Maybe he could be mayor of Buenos Aires, which is a big job down there. But then things went much more quickly. A few months after that, the peso collapsed. Argentina had this terrible economic crisis. The then president had to leave the Casa Rosada by a helicopter departing from the roof. And so I persuaded the New York Times to send me to Argentina to write about Macri. And I found him in this villa in Palermo, a very wealthy part of the capital. And he was triumphant. He said, because of the crisis, Argentines have rejected the whole leadership class, except, he said, for me. He said, I am seen as having done a serious and accountable job at Boca. My experience has come from the business sector. This is what I applied in the Boca period and with results. So football is this industry that can turn rich businessmen into regular guys and popular heroes. So he'd begun campaigning as a politician. It went very fast. He was elected to Congress. He did become mayor of Buenos Aires. And as you'll know, in 2015, he was elected president of Argentina. Now, he lost the presidency last year. All Argentine political careers end in economic crisis. His did as well. But still, the PowerPoint he had showed us in Oxford in 2001, very largely it came to pass as he had planned. Other examples, George Weah went from being the best Liberian footballer in history to now the country's president. Or look at other sports. Imran Khan, Pakistan's cricket captain during my childhood, one of my sporting heroes, is now Prime Minister of Pakistan. But I want to end with the guy who is perhaps the most successful sports politician on earth, although we usually don't perceive him like that. Donald Trump has been a regular figure in professional wrestling. He's one of the kind of celebrities attached to this sport. And this video is from 2011, which is 4 years before he began running. So it ends with the symbolic shaving of the head, the Samson and Delilah scene. And, you know, we think of Trump as a reality TV star, which of course he also is. But for a lot of Americans, especially working class Americans, because wrestling is a very working class sport, he was a wrestling figure. And he comes out of this world that is self-consciously fake. Everyone watching in that arena understands that the whole event is faked, you know, the hitting the referee and the shaving of the head, etc. It's all planned and staged. And this is the world that Donald Trump comes from, like reality TV, where reality is a very weak concept. It's not very important. And so nowadays when people like me say, oh, Donald Trump is lying, this is not true, he lives in this fake world, of course he does. And his supporters from the fields of wrestling and reality TV take that for granted. To them, this staged world is much more entertaining and more interesting and more important than the world of reality. So to understand how Donald Trump emerged and how he thinks, his wrestling background, and this is just one of many, many scenes where he appears in the wrestling world, helps you understand his relationship with reality and his popularity. So very briefly, this football and politics nexus, and more generally the sports politics nexus, has become more important in our dysfunctional, low-trust political age. And so I fear there's a lot more scope for charlatans to rise to political power using football, using sport. But I'll be very interested to hear what Raquel says, and then we'll have a discussion. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you, Simon. It's really an honor and a pleasure for us to have you here with us. And I, of course, knew that Simon would give us a really interesting talk about the many ways we can look at football. So what I would like to do today and to go through with you is to look at something that I'm currently researching and writing on, which is how football and the soft power of football is actually understood and put into practice by a country that we all now know, which is China. So in that sense, I would like just to make one disclaimer. Of course, I don't think that everything is about football, but I do think that for the Chinese elite, for the Chinese Communist Party, football is a really important element of their foreign policy, and the attempt to transform its hard power into some kind of soft power. I don't think it's working well, but I think that this is where we should start. So I think that we should start with one of my favorite football philosophers, Sven-Göran Eriksson. And he said at some point that there is more politics in football than in politics. So in that sense, politics in general, I mean domestic issues, I wrote about that moment in which David Cameron is unable to actually say his club, and everybody was, going wild. Everybody in the Labour Party was going, seriously, you can't name your football club? You're not a true fan. So I remember that moment perfectly. It didn't stop him from winning elections. But in any case, it did introduce an element of doubt into something that was supposed to be genuine. And I also don't think, and my basic assumption goes against all of those that tell you that you should not mix politics with sports and that politics and sports have nothing to do with each other. I totally reject this. Football can be used by democracies, football can be used by dictatorships and vice versa. But why do some leaders go to so much trouble in order to participate in a sport like China that has no cultural tradition in their home countries, or at least in terms of being a national sport, or in the case of Portugal, a national obsession? Why do they do this? Why, in the case of China, have they chosen their market Leninism, to use the expression of Richard McGregor, have chosen football as one of its many tools? And I think that we have to look at what constitutes soft power. Soft power is, of course, a concept that our people, international relations, we do enjoy. It was coined by Joseph Nye, and it's something that tries to look at a different element of power, which is very difficult to get, which is that power that you have when other countries want to follow you because they admire your culture, they admire your research, they admire the quality of your life, they admire your model. And Joseph Nye, in a later book, he actually lists a number of sources of soft power, and he includes one. He calls it, of course, soccer, and he says that Europe's primary sport, which is far more popular globally than American football or baseball. So in that sense, soft power, the ability to attract, the ability to co-opt rather than to coerce people, is actually something many countries try to attain, but it's really difficult to get. But dictatorships and soft power is not at all an easy task. You may admire China's economic growth, today lesser than a couple of years ago, but do you really admire the lifestyle? Do you really want to live like the Chinese? That would be the first one. And then secondly, soft power is much more about non-state sources rather than state-sponsored. Be it Hollywood, even Bollywood in India, or in the case of Europe, UEFA. Now, UEFA, and I think this quotation is really good, was not only faster than NATO or the European Union to expand its membership across Europe,
but much more successful at pulling the potential power of a united continent. At least in UEFA, we didn't get Brexit yet, but let's see how that goes. I think that, of course, there is here an element of market. There's an element of the professionalization of football. Modern football is highly competitive, but at the same time, it also shows you how one sport can actually be very appealing. So if I want to get into a European market, if I want to get into these societies, I think that one of the choices would be to go for football. So in that sense, and one of the things that I have been currently researching on is to look at the Belt and Road Initiative from a football perspective, in the sense of looking at how China has been able, within Europe, to actually have a footprint. Now, of course, I have here only some examples, but I think they're quite interesting. In the Premier League, Chinese companies have 13% of the stake in Manchester City. That was a deal actually made in 2015. I think that perhaps the best example in the Premier League is, of course, the Wolverhampton, which is owned by Fosun International since 2016, and for all of us has a lot of Portuguese players and a Portuguese manager. In Spain, La Liga, I think that the best example is, of course, Atlético de Madrid, who replaced their stadium, Vicente Calderón, with what is now called the Wanda Metropolitan. And of course, the Wanda Group, which started by owning around 25% of the stakes of the shares, but it then eventually is now, due to certain reductions, starting to have a lesser print. But in a sense, the stadium is big. It's a way of making and contacting and being able to address a much bigger audience. In Serie A, I still love Italian football after all these years. We have, I think the best example is Inter, the rival of Milan. Internazionale, why? It's owned by a Chinese company, Suning, and even the main sponsor of Inter, the traditional Pirelli, is actually owned by a Chinese company. It was actually bought prior to Inter itself. So, as you can imagine, there is an enormous interest in Chinese tours around Inter. And then I think for me, the most interesting example is the ownership of Slavia of Prague in the Czech Republic. Why? This is a club that has been traditionally the club of the intellectuals, of those who dissented from, of course, a communist dictatorship. And it was bought in 2016 by a China Energy Group, which at the time hit the spotlight when it bought 13% of Rosneft, the Russian company in terms of oil. Now, ever since then, there was a lot of discussion about this, but I think that it's also a link to the fact that the Czech Republic is crucial for the Belt and Road Initiative, and today you find a lot of discussion within the Czech civil society about how do we do this? How do we link each other to the Chinese? There's also a populist element here, and the level of Chinese investment has been huge. But at the same time, the level of dissatisfaction has also been very, very public. And I think that is also one thing that I think we should take into account. In a sense, to think that because you buy, and the club has been very successful since then as well, so that's also important, you're actually buying the hearts and minds of football fans. And what we do notice and what we do realize that it's not that, I would say, at all. So it's not a template for success, rather the opposite. Now, but the first example by Man City produced one of the most shared selfie in modern times, which is this one. as one of my friend's sons said, "Oh, that's Kun Agüero. Who are the other two?" He's very small. He loves Kun Agüero and Xi Jinping and David Cameron. And this was in 2015 when Xi Jinping was given the red carpet in the UK, and the stance of the Conservative Party at the moment was to develop a special relationship with Beijing. I do think that now after Brexit, they will come back to this narrative, no doubt. Now, this interest of European clubs, it's also present in China. We're talking about a country that has 1.3 billion people. And I think that the Man City chairman's statement at the time is very, very, very self-explanatory. Football is the most loved, played, and watched sport in the world. And in China, the exponential growth pathway for the game is both unique and hugely exciting. Translating, it means that China is or can be a huge market in terms of football. We have witnessed a development of many football schools in China, most of them sponsored by clubs. We have seen a Chinese league with many foreign players. Now the number is limited, and many foreign managers. And there was a point in which we would even see players who were not at the end of their careers going to China. For me, I think that the most obvious example was Witzel, and then of course he came back and is now playing for Borussia Dortmund. But I think that this element is quite interesting because, as Simon has mentioned, it is an illusion to think that dictatorships enjoy the power of the masses in football. It's actually the other way around. And you see a lot of these difficulties into play in Chinese stadiums. The fact that all players have to listen respectfully to the national anthem, and the fact that some of the foreign players have been publicly reprehended because they don't do that, or how you have to cheer. Now, we all know, and Xi Jinping, we do know, there are many things of Xi Jinping that we don't know, but we do know that he really enjoys football. And his goal, and he incorporated into his idea of the China dream, this is to say the moment in which China returns, comes back to what China considers to be its rightful place in the world, which is, of course, at the center, where it is used to be. In other words, the last 100 and 150 years were more an exception rather than the rule. The image of a weakened China is no longer to be. So he incorporates football into this big goal. And he publicly says the Chinese national team will enter the World Cup finals, China will host the World Cup, and the third goal, he hopes that China wins the World Cup. Now, these are very bold goals. I think even the first one is today quite difficult. The second one is probably the more feasible one, but even so. And it is this incorporation of football and to show the world that even in football, a sport that China has no tradition in it, is a realm in which China and Chinese initiative can actually excel. I think this is, of course, pretty much wishful thinking. I think that there are a lot of factors. Simon wrote in his Soccernomics that, of course, resources matter, and if you have a pool of 1.4 billion people, you're bound to do something. But on the other hand, look at what happened with basketball. I mean, there was this huge momentum with one Chinese player going to NBA, but it hasn't really developed into a kind of a national sports that you play in China as a nation. So I'm pretty skeptic on that one, despite the resources and despite the elements. Have Chinese players, club, and national team live up to the expectations? Not yet, and I don't see it in the foreseeable future. In fact, when we look at this region in the world, which team or which national team do we think of? We think of Japan. We think of South Korea. In fact, one of the most exciting games of the last World Cup was the game between Belgium and Japan, which Japan scoring 2 goals in the beginning of the second half, and then Belgium scoring 3 goals, the last one in the last minute of the game. It was absolutely exciting to watch. And Japanese, they do play really well. So is this investment, this Chinese investment, which we do know that from a certain point, from a certain level, is coordinated or co-opted by the Chinese state, is this paying off in terms of market access or high technology on the one hand? I think here we have witnessed in the last years a big change. There is now talk and action of greater screening, either by the European Commission, greater resistance on German and the French side, issues like reciprocity, transparency, and of course, everything that is connected with the 5G mobile technology. In that sense, I think that the honeymoon period is clearly over, and the European Commission has labeled China as a strategic competitor, and I think that's the perspective that will definitely prevail. Of course, 2019 have not been easy for the Chinese leadership. We only have to think of the issues pertaining the digital and the surveillance of Xinjiang, but of course, the big theme is Hong Kong and the protests of the Hong Kongers. Now, in terms of football, the willingness of some European leagues to please its Chinese market has led to the dissatisfaction. First of all, the different time zones. If you want to transmit live a game, you have to think of the time difference. I have 2 examples here. The first scheduling of the Barça-Real Madrid game, which was due to be around midday on a Saturday, and everybody was saying, no, this cannot be. And the main reason why, because it could be seen at dinner time in China. The second one was the same reasons, but in the French league, in which Lyon, Olympique Lyonnais, was having a game against Nantes, and of course, the same reason again. Of course, the first game, the Barcelona-Real Madrid, had to be rescheduled for obvious political reasons. And I think that it was one of the few issues in which I saw in the last years Real Madrid and Barcelona actually agreeing on something, that the game had to be live at dinner time in Spain rather than China. It was quite interesting to see. And at the end, they prevailed on a Wednesday. Some European clubs, thinking of this big, huge market, are even willing to change or simplify their logo, their symbols, and make them and turn them into brands, worldwide recognized brands, in order to be more effective in markets like China. And here I can only speak of my own club that said that one of the reasons for actually changing the logo was the Chinese market. In my view, I think that the Czech Republic is actually the most interesting case to watch, the tension between this issue of football and Chinese investment. There are many worries. There's also the idea of the communist ghost of Soviet times now being transformed into China. And when you go to the Czech Republic, you find an enormous debate, public discussion about the role of China in the Czech Republic. Now, I would like to just show you, this is from the Pew Research Center. They have this line of research that looks at how public opinions perceive countries. And of course, and this was done prior to the Hong Kong protests, so there's no influence in there. And when you look at this table, you see that the bigger the blue, the bigger the dissatisfaction. And when you look at the Czech Republic, it's quite interesting to see that it has evolved, and the Czech public opinion today is much more critical of China rather than the other way around. Of course, I know that this is not only due to football, of course, but I think it's quite interesting to see. Now, if it is true that there is this inclusion of the political elements in Chinese investment in football, I think that the other way around is also quite interesting to see. Now, this is not one of the best photos or the best images, but remember the game between Lyon and Nantes? And the fans, they were so displeased at the timing, at the hours that the game was supposed to be played, that they decided to fight back. What did they do on primetime television? They replicated the Tibetan flag in order for that to be viewed in China. And the French television did nothing to obscure the Tibetan flag, as you can see back, okay? So I think that's also interesting, the way you can use this and all its full potential. Now, I would like to just end this very brief presentation about a fascinating theme with one of my greatest idols, and of course also as a way of honoring Simon, who is with us today, which is this man, Johan Cruyff, the world's most famous 14. In my view, money is very important in football, and it was important for Cruyff, but it should always come second to the game. Thank you.
Thank you both for very, very insightful presentations. I have a couple of questions to get things started. One is about how politics gets into football, and the other one is how football contaminates politics. The first one is, if we look at soft power and this novelty concept that we've heard about in the last couple of years, that people refer to as sports washing, like this idea has been gaining traction, and it has become part of the debate. But at the end of the day, me as a sports fan, mainly as a sports fan, what I feel though is that football clubs and what pertains to this relationship with soft power, political soft power, are really much like a country or a nation. They're not looking at the well-being as a major indicator, the well-being of its fans or its players. They're not looking at the state of its identity. Like we don't look at Barcelona strictly on the basis of how well its fans, its culture is doing. We look at it on the basis of sports results and economic growth. So clubs are looking for economic growth. And my question is, if clubs are essentially driven by economic growth, how do we escape the soft power? Because it seems to me that what we're doing is trying to slowly incorporate this overwhelming presence of countries like Qatar, Russia, China in European football, and just finding ways to deal with that and maybe not get European fans too mad about it. That would be my first question. My second question is, I love the Donald Trump example, and it reminded me a few years back, before Donald Trump became a very serious matter. I remember the Huffington Post started labeling or cataloging the news about Donald Trump in the entertainment section. And for a while, it was strictly entertainment. And then he became president of the United States, and it was not as much fun anymore. or it still is, depending on our standpoint. But what this leads me to is, and this is a completely different matter. A few months ago, I was reading this interview by Liliane Thuram, a great player, an intellectual, essentially, right now. And it felt to me like he was too smart discussing the topic of racism. Like it felt to me like it had too much of an intellectual density coming from an former football player. And my question on that is, do we need, is it the dumbing down that is the problem, or is it our inability to sort of find ways to simplify messages in effective ways, such as Donald Trump has been doing for years? And I mean, according to some of the people that study the message, in a very successful fashion. Should we kind of refuse to oversimplify political messages in the same way that football has accomplished over many decades, or should we find ways to lightly embrace it in our political discourse? Those would be two initial questions.
I'll answer those very briefly. In football, money buys success. We showed in the book Soccernomics that the salary bill of each club, so how much you pay in salaries, very largely determines where you finish in the league. So cup competitions like the Champions League are a bit less predictable because, you know, one match, one ball against the post can decide the Champions League. But the league is won usually by the club with the highest salaries. The club with the lowest salaries finishes bottom. And so money from Qatar, money from Azerbaijan, these countries can be decisive. So without Qatari money, Barcelona is not a big club. Paris Saint-Germain is not a big club. So either you take that money or you accept that you will not be as successful. The alternative is Germany, where they have a rule that outside entities cannot buy football clubs. So you could not have a Paris Saint-Germain situation where the Qataris buy Bayern Munich. That's impossible. And in some ways that has worked well for German football. You don't have that foreign soft power use of German clubs by very dubious countries. On the other hand, it's also meant that Germany has not been successful in European club football. Germany should be the most powerful country in European club football, 80 million people, huge economy, great football tradition. And Germany does not do as well as Spain, which has half the population, is much poorer, because partly of rules on foreign money. It's not the only reason, but it's one reason. Compare Germany to England, there's a much starker case where English clubs are very largely owned by rich foreigners, and that has brought in money so that an English club will typically beat a German club. So that's the choice that you have to make. On simple messaging, I think that our side, the kind of anti-populist side, needs to have simple messaging. Not false messaging like Trump's, but simple. And I think UEFA's campaign of no to racism, where you see Cristiano Ronaldo or Messi or Robin speaking in their own language, those three words, no to racism in your language, I think those kinds of simple messages conveyed by trusted footballers can be very powerful. It's a good example. I'm glad that there are intellectuals like Thuram, as you say, who are thinking through these things at a much higher level of complexity. That's great, but you also need to convert that into a much simpler message.
I would agree with Simon, but what I do think is that we are coming to a point, honestly, that the market or the money that you make can have serious consequences on this relationship. The number of games that you play, I mean, the League Cup, the Cup, your league, then of course the European games, the tours that you have to make. I mean, it's, even recently, because Liverpool in the world clubs and against the Cup, and Klopp basically said, I'm going to make a choice and I'm going to win the international trophy and the Cup, well, you know, whatever.
League Cup.
League Cup, yes. So we have the same here in Portugal. I think my first worry is this one, is these are human beings, they're not machines, and you can't expect everybody to be like Messi, delivering all the time in all the games. It's near impossible. So I guess there are limits. Secondly is the fact that because of the intensity of these games and their number, what you do tend to have is clubs that have more money have also the ability to purchase and to have a good second line and a good third line of players. And that also contributes to the gap between the top and the lesser rich countries. Clubs, sorry. I mean, not all clubs are Leicester in that magical year that made Gary Lineker the most happy man on earth, but it's really an exception to this rule. Now, I'm not, at the same time, having lots of money doesn't mean you're going to be successful. You also have to have a strategy and be smart. Yesterday we were talking about Man United, which I think is a good example of lacking a coherent strategy, picking up the players and being able to build a team. So if on the one hand I of course realize the importance of money, and we have to think, for instance, of Gazprom sponsoring the Champions League, I don't know for how many years and so forth. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that we are now coming to a point in which I think some of the cracks in this are showing, and I think that they affect the quality of the game.
Yeah, can I just respond to that? It's true that our football has been permeated by very dubious companies and countries, from Gazprom to Qatar, all sorts of countries that we should have great suspicions of. And this does make football an uglier business. But what you're seeing is something that goes way beyond football, and Portugal feels this, London feels this, Paris feels it. We are 5% of the world's population in Western Europe. We are a shrinking part of world GDP. And these countries have this excess money to spend that they can buy not just our football, but our politics and our societies. And so what you see in football is just a symbolic representation of how all these very dubious people are buying up Lisbon, are buying up your political system, my political system. So I think if it were only football, I wouldn't be so bothered.
Great, so even more pessimistic than I am.
Sorry, Raquel, we went back and forth on this and focused mostly on UEFA football, cup football, as it exists right now, and domestic leagues. I actually would love to hear your thoughts, both of you, on this very real possibility that we might get a season-long European Super League of some sort, because I feel that would be a crucial manifestation of that soft power, I mean, financially speaking, because it just feels like over these past few decades, clubs were not always fueled by the target, like the growth objectives that they are being driven by now. And so it sort of feels like the only way forward to generate growth and to keep accelerating would be to embrace something like a season-long. And in that respect, I truly feel like, as a sports fan, not so much as someone that researches this, just strictly as a sports fan, although I understand how identity and money need to be intertwined somehow in modern football, I worry sometimes that we might just be defacing what football has given us over the past few decades.
There's a book written in 1968, a wonderful football book called The Football Man by Arthur Hopcroft. And he discusses a European Super League. And he says, well, everyone is talking about a European Super League, but I don't think it will happen. This is 1968. So here in 52 years later, I'm saying I don't think it will happen. I think Hopcroft is still right. Because the difference now is there is more of a global market for football. So you talk about Chinese watching, but also Americans. Because we are only 5%, it's the 95% who don't live here who are the growth market. And so to get Chinese and Americans watching, you have to play on the weekend. So if there's a European Super League, it has to be on a Saturday or a Sunday. So then you could have a game at 12 o'clock or 2 o'clock here, and both those groups can watch. Because the Champions League, the problem is it's a Tuesday or Wednesday night, so Americans are at work and the Asians are in bed. So you'd have to get the European teams, really just from 4 countries, England, Italy, Germany, Spain, to give up their Saturday leagues, their weekend leagues, and have a European Super League on the weekend. Now, the Spanish, the Germans, and Italians might be willing to do that because the television money from their leagues is not big enough. And if Barça and Real broke off, they would keep the Clásico TV money in. But the English won't do that because the Premier League has such a fantastic TV setup that Manchester United would much rather play Burnley on Saturday than play Inter Milan on Saturday. So the English are going to say, no, we're happy with the Premier League as it is, and we'll keep playing the Champions League on Tuesday, Wednesday. That gives us less money than the Premier League. So without the English, you don't have a European Super League. So I don't think it's going to happen. And also clubs like Bayern and Barcelona will hesitate because, as you say, this breach of tradition, it's shocking to everyone. So I don't see this happening anytime soon at all. I think we're going to stay with what we have. The Champions League is the European Super League. And I think the Champions League will grow a bit so that a club like Manchester United, not very successful right now, will have more of a guarantee of playing in the Super League, in the Champions League every year. So let's say you have 7 English clubs and no Polish clubs or no Portuguese clubs. So I think the evolution of the Champions League that way will continue, but the domestic leagues will survive.
I would definitely agree with that, and that was one thing that I was going to focus on, this idea of having a super league. But I think that just coming back to the soft power and the use of football, Simon mentioned racism and the campaign to end racism and to alert and put people more aware of it. I mean, in this weekend, in the last weekend, we just witnessed a very powerful moment. You know, Iñaki Williams, the player from Atletico de Bilbao, who is black, and he suffered the abuse of racist insults. And in the game, they were playing Espanyol, which is a club from Barcelona, and the home fans and the home team at minute 9, which is his shirt number, they all applauded it and sang his name. So in that sense, I think that there is some good things you can do with all this economics and all this power. But of course, there's also another side, which is the business, the market side. And I think that for us Portuguese, our problem or our dilemma is not so much the Super League. Our dilemma is to still have a competitive football and not having all your youth and all your talented youth joining the English clubs and the German clubs and the Italian clubs and the Spanish club and leaving the teams in Portugal. That's our dilemma, because you need that money in order to survive. And we have just now had Bruno Fernandes going to Manchester United and many others, but at the same time, you have your teams like Benfica, Porto, Sporting, and Braga, which are less competitive because they're losing their talent. So I think that for us is the dilemma.
Yeah, but smaller leagues, I mean, I follow the Dutch league, same as the Portuguese league, have been losing their talents for 25 years. But Portuguese people still like football. Dutch people still like domestic football. So Benfica and Porto and Ajax and PSV are not great clubs most of the time, but they're still very popular. People still care. So, and even smaller clubs like Guimarães or like Utrecht in Holland, they're popular as well. And so I'm not sure that you have to be world-class, have world-class clubs to remain a popular obsession.
I think that it will remain popular. We are a football country. But you know, when you're looking at your team and you think that you could fare better in terms of European, because that also brings you money as well, as also, you know, it's kind of a place where you can shine. But I think that's just a dilemma. Of course that nothing beats watching my team play. So in that sense, of course, I will remain a fan.
I just think that sometimes we worry too much about the lack of competitiveness in football. So I don't think Benfica or Ajax are going to win the Champions League in the next 20 years. And in a way, that's sad. But it's actually not that big a deal. I mean, we still care. We still follow it, and we change our expectations. So now if you're Benfica or Ajax, then qualifying for the second round of the Champions League is really exciting and very gratifying. So you have different targets. Just like if you're Maritimo, you don't think, oh, I'm really sad that we don't win the Portuguese league. You have different targets, like maybe you beat Benfica, maybe you avoid relegation. So all clubs in football have their own targets. They don't need to be Real Madrid. And we have an ecosystem where there is a place for the big, the small, and the medium.
Should we take some questions from the audience? Who wants to? Sure.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Kuper and Ms. Raquel, for your word. I want to ask two questions. One to Mr. Kuper is about the use of football to hide the social and economic problems in less developed countries. I think that in Africa or in Latin America, in less developed countries before in the past, this practice was used in order to avoid problems with the people, to hide the economic and social problems, use football as the people's opium, people's drug. And for example, in Algeria, it has been used for years, and we have seen, like in last year, the peaceful revolution, when the country won the African Cup. The people celebrated for a few days and then went back to demonstrate against the political regime, saying that we won't fall again in that trap of being lied to through football and other sports. It has been used in Black Africa also, and even in Russia, for example, in the Olympic Games, where Putin was wanted to project his ideologies and his ideas to Europe and to his people through the use of soft power, as Ms. Raquel mentioned. And the second question is the importance, both of you, is the importance of football in the global economy in general. Because, for example, in Brazil, football has plays a percentage in the Brazilian economy.
I'll go very briefly. I think the idea that football is the opium of the people, that's what I was trying to say about Argentina in 1978, massively underestimates the people, if you like. So Algerians are happy when they win the African Cup, but they completely understand that they have social and economic problems. So I don't think people are so naive or stupid as to think, well, my football team has won and so I don't care about my problems and I love the government. People are very able to make that separation. So I covered the World Cup in Russia. I was very interested in the political question. Putin tried to use the World Cup to announce a rise in the pension age. He announced that just as the World Cup was starting, hoping this would be forgotten. Russians noticed, they were very angry, and Putin's approval ratings during this successful World Cup fell to an all-time low because it was felt not only was he raising the pension age, but he was also trying to do it in a sneaky way using football. So I think almost everyone is very able to make that separation between enjoying football and having an assessment of their political situation. Secondly, the size of football in the economy, I think we tend to overestimate that as well. I ran the numbers on Real Madrid, which is about the football club in the world with the highest revenues. Last time I checked, Real Madrid have lower revenues than 120 companies in Finland. A Finnish friend of mine who's an economic analyst did this analysis. Real Madrid's revenues are about 1 billion euros, biggest football club in the world, more or less, with Barca. But there are 120 companies in Finland, the small country, that are bigger than that. And Real Madrid and Barca make almost no profits, football clubs don't. So if you just look at professional football as a sector in Europe, it's about 15 billion euros a year, a bit more now. I mean, that's smaller than Siemens, the German company, just by itself, last time I checked. So football matters to us in an outsized way compared to its economic importance.
I agree with Simon. I think that the Russian example is very good. It was quite interesting when I remember when the Russians they did that session in which they showed what would be the logo and the message of the football. They projected, you know, a map, and that map, of course, included Crimea, which had just been annexed, and it was as if it was something that you wouldn't discuss. You would take it for granted. But it had the opposite effect. Of course, the Ukrainian delegation jumped. Everybody jumped. So and it backfired. So they had to present another map without Crimea being part of the Russian Federation. So I think that I definitely agree with the comments made and the answers by Simon. Football is good, is brilliant. I mean, I remember what I felt when we won the cup against the French in France. It was so good. But then it goes away and you're back to your problems. And I think that for quite some time, we have tended to, and I think that's also the mistake that China makes by buying these clubs and by getting to this kind of business, because it thinks that by doing so, it will be rewarded and it will be able to get the hearts and minds of the football fans / citizens. And I think that's a misperception or I think a big error in terms of not understanding the football fans or the citizens.
I think with China it's different because China, we all have a view of China in so many ways, from the coronavirus to the camps where Muslims are locked up. China is such a major actor on the world stage that almost everybody has a view of it. But if you're a tiny country like Qatar or Abu Dhabi, and nobody in Europe knows what you are. I mean, 10 years ago, how many Europeans had heard of Qatar? For a country like that with no profile, football can become your profile. With Qatar, it's also been damaging for Qatar because it's highlighted the terrible situation for foreign workers there. But I think using football as Abu Dhabi or Qatar is different from using football as China, where you already have a very clear reputation.
Hi, thank you. My question has to do with something that you both have been silent about, and that is FIFA and the role that it played as a political institution around the world. Any comments on that?
I think that we tend to think of football as with any other sports. The fair play, the competition, the intrinsic values of playing well and fairly, that we sometimes forget that human nature has also a tendency to grab these moments. And of course, if something is very successful and has a very high revenue, then it's also very prone to corruption. There was a lot of discussion, and I talk a lot about that in my book, about the bids for instance, Russia and Qatar winning the World Championship and hosting the games. And the same goes, for instance, with the Olympic Games, which also went through a big scandal. I think that the main point, and I think that it's for you to learn with the mistakes and to develop a coherent and credible system of checks and balances. This is to say, people that can actually monitor and be able to have greater financial transparency in the way the game is played. I mean, if you want the game to be more popular, then either FIFA or the other regional associations, they also have to develop those standards. But at the same time, as of course we know, because it involves a lot of money, it also, of course, has the potential, in some countries more than others, to be prone to corruption. I think that is pretty much the basic assumption.
One other thing that's happened with FIFA is that it was a historically European institution, European, Latin American, which were the only two continents that had a big role in football until the 90s. And now FIFA has been captured by Saudi Arabian, most recently, as well as Gulf, as well as Qatari and Russian money. So it's a kind of microcosm of the oligarchical regimes outside coming in with way more money than you can get hold of in Europe. And this unregulated entity based in Europe takes this money in both corrupt and legal ways, and is then becomes a creature now of Saudi Arabia most recently.
First of all, I would like to congratulate you. This is a very fascinating talk, Raquel and Simon and Vasco. But I wonder why no one of you have spoken about the organized groups of fans, what we call in Portugal the claques, the hooligans, sometime in England. The point is that the moment we are living in most of Europe is a moment where populism is growing and democracy is weakened. And my point is, what is your thoughts about the infiltration of these organized groups of fans and the capture of their, let's say, their capacity of doing things by these populist groups, mostly from extreme right? And this is something that is not only destroying, in Portugal particularly, part of the soccer sport, because a lot of families do not go to stadiums because of this. They stay at home. But they have also, for example, in Portugal, if we ask to ourselves, who is the more populist guy in Portugal, I would say Bruno de Carvalho, that was the former president of Sporting, that could really took advantage, and he was pushed organized groups of fans as his most, let's say, group of people that maintained him in power until a certain point. So this is, I would like to have your things. What is happening now with these organized groups of fans? You have, in a certain point, with some help of Margaret Thatcher, you solved a little of this problem in Britain, I believe. But the rest of Europe, the continental Europe, a lot of countries have not solved this. So I would like your thoughts. Thank you.
Fernando, for your question. I think that it's a problem that has to be faced, you cannot allow violence in stadiums. And I think that here, despite UEFA's guidelines, countries are on different levels. I remember watching the final between Liverpool and Juventus, the in Isle Park, that ended with the deaths of many Italian supporters. I remember the game, and I remember that I was rooting for Liverpool, and at some point the game just didn't matter at all. And at the end, Juventus won 1-0, I think a goal by Platini, if I'm not mistaken, but it didn't matter anymore. UEFA banned the English, but I think that what really happened within the English Premier League 2B was that a cleanup of the hooligans and a cleanup of many of these organized violent groups. In that sense, for instance, there is a big contrast
with the Italian reality, in which, to the exception of one or two clubs, you still have a lot of these in Italian stadiums. For instance, a game between, I remember last year when Lazio was playing Roma, and the neo-fascist ultras, the Irriducibili, they decided that they needed to, get a go at Roma. And what they did was they dressed Anne Frank with the Roma t-shirt, and that for them was an insult. But on the other side, I think that in Portugal, we have problems with our organized ultras or our organized. I think that, are they really football fans? I think that what they do want is, because the stadium is the mass spectacle of today, that is their forum for expressing it. And I think that, when I see some things in my stadium, when things go up and whatever, those are not football fans, and they have to be differentiated from the others. But that also implies having the ability and the courage to face it. I think the English did that in a very, very positive way. I'm not afraid, of course. I go to my stadium and I go with my family and everything is okay. But of course, there are some behaviors that I find absolutely disgusting and have nothing to do with football. But they are televised, and that's exactly what you want. So in that sense, I think that countries in Europe are on different levels of recognizing the problem. I always remember as well one of the biography. I really like biographies and footballers' biographies, even if they're not all very good, as Simon kept telling me yesterday. But I think one that was quite interesting was the one written by one of my idols, Andrea Pirlo. And he, in the book, he addresses the issue of racism, which at the time was mostly condensed in the person of Balotelli. And he said that the coaches, they always said the same. If you hear a racist abuse, you just go over and you hug Balotelli. And I think that is a very important message. But in Italy, the problems are still there, and they are just, swept under the carpet. And I think they're quite serious.
I would just say that these problems can only be solved by using police, because if you let the club run things, the club doesn't have the means to confront the ultras. The club is afraid of them, the club president is afraid of them, the ultras know where he lives. And often the club president has an alliance with the ultras, so the ultras will not attack him in their chanting, and he will fund their travel, etc. The only way to break this up is to criminalize, for example, racist chants or violence. It's very easy to know who does this. It's only a few hundred people. You have CCTV in the stadiums. And what's worked well in Britain is it's a police matter. The police says, we have you on camera hitting somebody. You're not allowed to come to the stadium for the next 5 years. You have to report to the police station during matches of your team. And so it's not so difficult, but you have to take it out of the control or non-control of the club and turn it into a police matter, which is expensive and takes a lot of police time and organization, but in the end it works.
Very quickly, yeah, I keep saying it, but it really doesn't matter, so that's another topic. As someone who presented himself as a football fan, I would just like to argue that although, football faces a lot of moral conundrums right now. A lot of them money-driven, some more about how football intersects with identity politics and stuff like that. I would still argue, though, that if you look for the noblest manifestations or impacts of football, you would still find those in the fans. And they get a lot of bad rep because of these fringes, these populist fringes that somehow contaminate and really drive a negative perception. But still, at the end of the day, if anyone that goes to a stadium regularly will see that the purest representation of what football truly means, and the reason why, as Simon was saying earlier, even if we don't win the Champions Cup, we'll still go to the stadium and enjoy the game, is because of the fans, because of the atmosphere, the experiential value that is part of all this, and that you cannot find it anywhere else but in a person sitting next to you. That's the way I feel. But having said that, it is true that it is also a very powerful force that drives a populist discourse, and we don't see enough reaction. A lot of other people might want to ask additional questions, but I would just like to ask this very quick question, which is, there's been this sort of rise in recent years, maybe not rise, but social platforms have definitely helped enhance their visibility of the idea of I believe, the fans as activists, or the athlete even as an activist. Do you feel football clubs have done enough to sort of stand by these people or these groups of people, or do you feel that they should just stick to football in some ways?
I think clubs could do more to support activism. So AS Roma has been very good in supporting anti-racist activism and criticizing the Italian Football Federation for collusion with racism. So I would like to see clubs, which are very powerful institutions, taking that side much more.
First of all, good morning to everybody, and good morning especially to you three. I have two questions. One about the Chinese investment in European leagues. Is, instead of a domestic victory, Xi Jinping is looking for an international victory of China? For example, he's not looking for bring China into the football world. He's not hoping to win elections because of football. He's hoping to affirm China in the world with football. And the other question, could it be that we see sport winners, for example, like Donald Trump or Berlusconi, as probably a good candidate in a political position, because modern societies look to sports in the same way that ancient societies look, for example, to great generals or great warriors, like, you actually made us survive this war, you killed a bunch of enemies, so you are a good leader for us. So could we is an ancient relic from those times? Thank you.
I'll take the second question. I'll leave the China question to you. I think the parallel with the heroic status of generals in the past is a good one. So the Argentine military regime, like so many military regimes in South America, said, well, we are military men, and the masculinity is a big part of the offer. We will restore traditional values, and we will be tough, and we protect the country domestically against foreign enemies and internal enemies. And of course, as war between countries has disappeared, most wars we now have are civil wars or guerrilla uprisings within one country. The public status of militaries is gone. I mean, who can name a general in their country? So in France in 1940, the most popular person in the country to unite this defeated country is Marshal Pétain, because he was a World War I hero. That wouldn't be the case now. So yes, sport is now the most visible arena of defending the nation's honor, and also of masculinity. A kind of new form of highly valued masculinity replaces military, often adopts military language like fighting, courage, honor, defeating. So I think that is quite a good parallel.
I would also agree with you. I think that today's world, and at least here in Europe, we don't have Scipius Africanus of the Roman Republic, or Julius Caesar, or Augustus in a different way. But I think that the correlation is absolutely there. And I think that, for instance, the title of Simon's first book, The Battle Against the Enemy, is also,
Football against the enemy.
Sorry, Football Against the Enemy, is also a good line. Of course we do that, and in that sense, that's how you would measure heroics or success. I usually tell my students that if they want to see Portuguese heroism, they should see the game that Portugal played against North Korea in 1966, and the goal scored by Eusébio. So, and I think it's a good example. So there, I'm with you, and I also agree. As for the China, it has two elements. I think that it also has a domestic one. China doesn't like to lose to Japan or the other countries, but at the same time, it's mostly because it's not an easy thing to do. I mean, you may have this idea that, you can move mountains, but China is way beyond the Maoist expectation of, the new man and being able to do everything. So there's at the moment a lot of tensions. You see, for instance, some of the early statements of the president of the Chinese Federation of Football. He actually wanted, more foreigners and more help into getting the game going. And then there was a backlash, a nationalist backlash, saying, we have all these foreigners, they don't love China, they love the money and so forth. So it was a big discussion. So they limited to 3 foreigners per team. And I think that the external dimension is included in this China dream, to me, in a very obvious way. I don't think that it is being as effective, or at least it's not delivering according to the expectations that were initially pushed. And coming back to all the examples that I talked about, there are many others. I think that the Czech Republic is actually, I think, the best example for you to see that. It's not easy winning the hearts and minds. And there's a lot of, I think, over expectations on China's regard as to what a football fan would prevail over you being a citizen. Thank you.
Hello, good morning. I'm from a political science and international relations background, just to warn. I have 2 questions for each of you. So my first questions would be for Raquel, and I would like to hear your comments on what you said about the lower leagues. Would you say that the lower leagues problem is a problem of financement or investment, because it's difficult to invest in several of these countries, for example, Portugal, Greece, and the amount of bureaucracy that is related to this, and for example, if you would relate that as well with season tickets that are more expensive in comparison to our average wage or salaries. The other question for Raquel would be about the impact of Belt and Road Initiative and Africa, and what are your comments on China building stadiums for CAN and the African competitions there? So, and this is related also to a big issue for me, that is, how can this sport, the beautiful game, can help some countries improving or not economically, and have a say in the world stage as well. For example, I'm thinking about an example that I found not in Africa but in the Middle East that is actually happening. They're developing, I don't remember where exactly, a football academy to help young kids to play and like try to engage with each other and don't have a go in wars when they're grown up. And for Simon Kuper, I would like to have 2 questions. One would be like, we mentioned that players have a good potential to address problems like racism, but on the other hand, would you consider that players like, I'm thinking about Felipe Melo in Brazil, that used his image, which is particularly famous in Brazil, not so much outside, to basically had a say in propaganda to Jair Bolsonaro, for example? And would you say that those are examples that might go against what we said, and how can we address these problems? And for Simon, I would like to ask what he thinks about, for example, Viktor Orban, France, who are owners of some sports newspapers, which are a big thing in Hungary, and how they are like spreading his message and his ideas of Hungarian politics. That's it. Thank you.
First question, the issue of investment and financing. I think Simon has already touched upon this. What made the Premier League was the collective negotiation of TV rights and the way that was distributed amongst the clubs according to their ranking and so forth. And that made a huge difference. Even if we look today at the budgets of, for instance, well, I'm always talking about Leicester, and Leicester is actually doing very well in this season. So I don't know, all the English clubs, even the ones that don't do well, they have enormous budgets, particularly when compared to ours. I think in that sense, there was a greater collective, I wouldn't say identity, but a strategy. They understood that in the medium and the long run, it was very good for the big clubs as well to have greater competition and to sell that as a kind of a business model as well. So I think that's one of the reasons regarding other countries. For instance, look at the La Liga. I mean, Barcelona and Real Madrid, they fought the idea to the very end because, of course, they themselves, they get all that money from, from transmitting their games. They don't need the other one. So I think that it's either thinking about having a strategy as a whole or thinking just about yourself, and that's it. So that would be your second question. China and Africa. Africa is a continent in which China has had greater success. And in that sense, football is no exception. They build roads, they build hospitals, they build airports, and of course they build stadiums, and they invest in all of these infrastructures. And they do it with a competitive price that nobody can actually beat. So in that sense, the history of the Chinese presence in Africa includes the infrastructures regarding football, and that is, of course, a very clever way of getting really into the game. I think that in Africa, Europe is losing ground. The United States never actually was able to have ground in Europe, in Africa, and China, with that very with this idea that they developed in terms of their foreign policy, which is to say to Africa, listen, we never colonized Africa, we were not colonizers. So in that sense, we are what the Chinese like to say, all-weather friends. And the African countries were also all-weather friends when they did not publicly criticize China after the massacre of Tiananmen in 1989. So in that sense, it's a relationship that goes both ways, but I think that it's not remarkable at all that China has a stake in African football. I think it's just obvious of the general tendency.
Very briefly, you mentioned Felipe Melo. I mean, of course, football is not only a force for good, it's also often a force for bad. Football is a very powerful messaging system, so it can be used by anyone, good or bad. And so Ronaldinho also supported Bolsonaro. That may have helped a bit. So yes, I mean, football isn't one thing or the other. It's anything depending on who uses it. Orban, I mean, I'm sure his friends control the sports media. I'm much more worried about Orban's control of the entire Hungarian media, from state TV to being able to starve newspapers of advertising if he doesn't like them. So I don't think the sports media are the most important part of that system. Orban, who was a very good footballer himself, has put a lot of money into Hungarian football, which has backfired in a way, like with the Argentinian generals, partly because he hasn't made Hungarian football much better, it hasn't worked, and secondly because Hungarians think, well, why put that money into football? Why not put it into something else? I mean, you mentioned Middle Eastern country where people try to use football as a force for good with academies. if you want to spend money as a force for good, I mean, build schools, build hospitals. The last thing I'd start with is a football academy.
Thank you very much for this very interesting conversation. I just have two questions, quick, I think. One is, what was the role of football during the Portuguese dictatorship? I remember the saying, faith, football, and fado. And the second one is, what can be the role of Portugal, given football leaks in the current times that we live, and also of the issues on sport integrity that you also discussed? Thanks.
Well, I think that dictators, whether or not they're football fans, and we know that Salazar was not a football fan, tend to co-opt the success of your team, any team. I mean, I think that in that sense, Franco was much more obvious, and even because Santiago Bernabéu was a known Franquista, so in that sense, Real Madrid was the expression of what he thought his Spain should be. I am very hesitant to make the same parallel as to Benfica, and it's not because I'm a Benfica fan. There is a difference. I don't think Salazar was not at ease in football stadiums. He didn't like the masses. He was not Mussolini going for the national team. But of course, that dictatorships, and particularly in times when you are internationally isolated or less integrated, if you want to put it more euphemistically, you tend to use what you get or what you can have. And in that sense, football was used as a way of being able to become less isolated, either through the national team, the '66 World Cup, in which we were robbed by the English, but that's another issue. And the second thing is the success of specific clubs, in this case Benfica in the '60s. So my point would be that reinforcing what Simon has just said, football can be used like so many other things, like religion, like politics. It can be used for good and for bad. Dictatorships use football success. I think Orban was trying to revive the great Magyar national team, and he was hopeless in that. But at the same time, look, for instance, even democracies. When Dilma Rousseff, as president of Brazil, and Brazil organized the Copa, she clearly made that a political statement, and it should be. Brazil is a country of football. Of course, the semifinal against Germany was not in Brazil's plans, so everything backfired. You already had a lot of mass protests, specifically on this topic. Why spend so much money on stadiums when you have so many social and so many economic problems for so many people? So the semifinal was like the perfect storm in terms of the political establishment. My point is, and I am not attempting at any point in brainwashing dictatorship at all, please get this right. I'm just saying that dictatorships use football the same way as they use democracies. And last point, dictatorships, they use the success of football, but they don't like masses of people in stadiums talking to each other freely, and they actually fear the coming together of this public, of these fans, whatever, and the ability of them identifying and connecting to each other. That is usually a rival, alternative source of power. And that, for any dictator or for any dictatorship, is extremely dangerous. You cannot control these people. And I think that's usually the first instance. That would be my thing to say. Did I have a second question? I'll leave that to Simon. He's with the FT.
Yeah, you guys have all I'd say is you guys have an outsized place in the football world. At one point you had the most famous manager in the world, Mourinho, the most famous footballer in the world, and the most famous agent in the world with Jorge Mendes. And now with football leagues, you've again broken new ground, so congratulations.
Thanks a lot also, very interesting to Raquel, to Vasco and to Simon. My first question is again going back at Raquel's presentation about China. And I do sympathize with your view about China, and I read a lot about China. I've studied China, and your concerns are my concerns also. But don't you think that football is just a consequence of everything else they're doing in the Western world? I mean, if you look at the examples you gave, still comparing to how much they're entering banks, companies, it's very small. And my second question is related to the fact of us taking maybe football too seriously. Do you not think that this link between football and politics, and Simon gave a very good example of how it was, in certain senses, very unproductive, both for politics and maybe for football, especially because politics has leads with a number of variables that football doesn't and should be taken as something much more serious. Is it not because we take football definitely too seriously, and we give these football agents a role that they should not have in modern society?
I'll briefly take the second question first. I mean, do we as analysts overestimate the role, or does society give too much of a role? I mean, I certainly think that usually football has no impact on society or the world. And when people say, oh, you know, football, France winning the World Cup helped unite French people of all colors and end racism in France, or Brazil winning the World Cup kept the military regime in power. Usually that's nonsense. I mean, I agree, football's role in changing society is usually tiny. I've cited some examples like Berlusconi or Marquês, where football clearly does make a change to the politics of one country. Usually football changes nothing. What's interesting, I think, to me as an observer is football is a great way to understand things that are happening inside society. So often, for example, debates about racism are conducted through football. How much racism is in there in our society? Who are the racists? What can we do about it? In France, you know, is France a white country or is it a multicultural country? These arguments are had through football. So when you look at football, you understand the country. So football is a lens, but football is not an instrument that changes society usually. I agree.
Back to your question, I think I state that obviously. I think that there is the Belt and Road, and football is a small part of that Belt and Road, absolutely. But I think it's an interesting one, and I think that for a country that has no tradition of looking at the game as a national sport, and that was that's why I think it's really interesting to see. And just to come back to this issue of racism and the previous question, I think that one of the reasons why Salazar also co-opted the success of the national team and Benfica was, well, I think it's also a good way of having the lens to analyze the dictatorship, because you had a team that had people from the colonies, and in that sense, it enabled Salazar to project this idyllic view of harmony between blacks and whites and so forth, which he wanted to project, but of course against the reality, which was the racism included in that assumption. And in that sense, I think that it's also an interesting way of trying to understand how you would want to project an ideal nation, an ideal country, and then the reality. So in that sense, coming back to your question, I think that's also the second point. I also agree with Simon. I think that
it's a good way to understand. And I use football, not a lot, but I use some of these examples to make my students of international relations understand better the issues. When I want them to understand, for instance, why is Europe so important to countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, I use the example of the sponsors of football clubs, you know, like Fly Emirates, Qatar, and so forth. And that helps them to understand better why countries have this, I think was Joshua Kurlansich, have these charm offensives in markets in which they generally have a very negative perception in terms of human rights, and of course, don't even mention the words democracy. So.
That's it. Thank you again to everyone who joined us this morning. And myself, I need to thank again to Club Lisboa for the invitation. I hope you guys everyone had a good time. I really felt it was an insightful conversation, and yeah, see you next time.